She walked off the court with her head down, her racket already packed, and something behind her eyes that looked less like disappointment and more like exhaustion. The kind that sleep does not fix. By the time Emma Raducanu reached the press conference room, the result was already secondary. What the room witnessed in the minutes that followed was not a player processing a loss. It was a young woman confronting the accumulated weight of everything that professional tennis at the highest level demands, and, for a moment at least, visibly struggling under it. What happened here tonight was not just a difficult defeat. It was something the WTA has not seen from Raducanu in quite this way before, and the sport is paying close attention. The match itself had been brutal in the truest sense of that word. Not brutal because of poor play. In fact, there were stretches during the contest where Raducanu moved and struck the ball with the kind of precision that reminded the watching world exactly why. At 18 years old, she walked off Arthur Ashe Stadium as a United States Open champion without dropping a single set throughout the entire draw. That memory, extraordinary as it remains, is also part of what makes the current chapter of her career so difficult to watch unfold, because the gap between that September evening in New York and where she now finds herself in the rankings, in her physical condition, and in the public narrative surrounding her career, that gap is not small, and it does not close easily. In tonight's match, Raducanu went to a deciding third set for the fourth time in her last 6 outings. She had led in the second set. She had controlled rallies from the baseline with authority. And then, in the manner that has become one of the most discussed and dissected patterns in her recent form, the match shifted. Errors that had been absent from her game for an hour began to reappear. Her first serve percentage dropped at the worst possible moments. Her opponent, composed and relentless, applied pressure to exactly the areas that Raducanu's game, in its current state, found most difficult to manage. By the time the final point was played, the scoreline told only part of the story. The part it did not tell was written on her face as she walked to the net. The press conference that followed was, by any professional standard, composed. Raducanu sat down, answered questions, and maintained the public discipline that has characterized her media appearances. Even during the most difficult stretches of her career, she has never been a player who uses press conferences as a venue for public grievance. She is measured, she is thoughtful, and she speaks about tennis with an intelligence that consistently impresses those who cover the sport closely. But tonight was different in the way that small differences carry enormous weight. Her composure did not crack, but it bent visibly in the moments between answers. Those present in the room described an athlete who was working hard to hold a very specific line, and who, at certain points, came close to not holding it. She acknowledged that the physical demands of the current stretch of the season had taken more from her than she had anticipated. She made clear that the stop-start nature of her recent years, the injuries, the surgeries, the periods away from competition followed by the pressure of returning and immediately needing to perform at the level the public expects, had created a cumulative fatigue that was not purely physical. She revealed, carefully and without self-pity, that there were moments on court tonight where the mental and emotional load of her situation felt heavier than anything her legs or her forehand could manage. And in that admission, offered quietly, without drama, to a room full of journalists, lay the real story of the evening. If you follow the emotional and competitive side of women's tennis and want reporting like this, but the moment stories like this break, subscribing and turning on notifications takes less than 5 seconds and ensures you never find yourself catching up to a story you should have been inside from the start. The broader stakes here are significant, and they deserve to be stated clearly. Raducanu's ranking has been one of the most complicated narratives in women's tennis over the past 3 years. After her 2021 US Open victory, she entered the WTA's top 10, a position that, under normal circumstances, would represent a stable foundation from which to build a long career among the sport's elite. What followed instead was a sequence of injury setbacks that disrupted her ability to defend points, compete consistently, and develop the kind of match-hardened rhythm that separates the players who win slams from the players who contend for them. Each time she returned from a layoff, the ranking math worked against her. Each time she played through discomfort and lost, the narrative around her tightened. Tonight's result carries ranking consequences that she will feel heading into the next phase of the season. Points she needed from this event will not arrive. The seedings she requires at upcoming tournaments, seedings that dictate draws and draws that dictate whether a player rebuilds confidence or gets thrown back into the deep end, will be harder to secure. Her path to Grand Slam quarters and beyond, already narrow, just became narrower. And all of this, the rankings arithmetic, the seeding math, the tournament planning, sits behind every answer she gives in every press conference while she attempts to discuss the more immediate and human question of how she is feeling. The rivalry context matters here too. The players who occupy the upper tier of the WTA rankings right now are not a forgiving group. Aryna Sabalenka's power, Iga Swiatek's relentless consistency, the new generation of physically imposing and tactically sophisticated players coming through. The margin for Raducanu to re-establish herself as a top 10 presence has not widened as the months have passed. If anything, the ceiling has become harder to reach while the field has only grown stronger. Tonight's loss, viewed in that context, is not simply a bad evening. It is a data point in a pattern that the WTA's analysts, ranking computers, and rival camps will all have noted. The reaction from the tennis community, both inside the game and among the broader audience that follows it, reflects an unusual and revealing division. On one side, there is impatience, the kind that follows any athlete who arrives with extraordinary promise and has not yet converted that promise into sustained success. This reaction is neither fair nor unfair. It is simply the mathematics of expectation operating at its most unforgiving. Raducanu is 22 years old. She won a Grand Slam. The public, the sponsors, the broadcasters, and the algorithms that measure sporting relevance all made the same calculation in the same moment. This is a generational talent, and the career trajectory should reflect that. When it does not, the gap between expectation and reality generates noise. On the other side, and this group appears to be growing, there is something that functions less like sympathy and more like genuine recognition. Former players who have spoken about their own experiences navigating the pressure that arrives with an early enormous success have found in Raducanu's story a mirror that is uncomfortable to look at directly. The names who rose fast and burned bright before stabilizing, or before not stabilizing, are not obscure names in this sport. Women's tennis has a long history of prodigies who arrived under extraordinary circumstances and were then required to sustain that arrival without adequate support, structure, or simply time. The conversations happening in coaching circles, in sport psychology conferences, and among the WTA's own welfare staff are louder now than they were 6 months ago. And this is where the story stops being about Emma Raducanu specifically and starts being about something that the sport of women's tennis has not fully resolved. The mental and emotional infrastructure available to elite players has improved meaningfully in recent years. The WTA has invested in player well-being programs. The conversation around mental health in sport, driven in large part by athletes like Naomi Osaka, who chose public visibility over private suffering, has shifted the cultural baseline. Players speak about pressure, about anxiety, about the psychological cost of performing at the highest level more openly than the generation before them. That is progress. But progress is not resolution. And what tonight's press conference made visible, quietly, without melodrama, in the careful and controlled way that Raducanu handles everything, is that the infrastructure, for all its improvement, still leaves individual athletes carrying the heaviest loads largely alone. She is 22. She is trying to rebuild a ranking, manage a body that has required surgical intervention multiple times before her mid-20s. Maintain a game that demands constant refinement at the highest level of her sport. And simultaneously manage the public identity of a US Open champion in a media environment that is neither patient nor proportionate. The coaches who have come and gone. The questions that follow every change. The constant re-evaluation in public of decisions that any other 22-year-old would be permitted to make in private. The weight of all of it was visible in that press conference room tonight in a way that it has rarely been before. She did not break down in the way the narrative around this story might suggest. She did not cry. She did not storm out. She did not issue an angry statement or lose her composure in any way that would generate the kind of content that social media rewards. What she did was something quieter and, in its own way, more significant. She sat in a room full of people whose job is to extract information, and she told the truth about how she was feeling minimally, carefully, and with the restraint of someone who has learned that the truth, in her position, always costs something. The coming weeks will tell a significant part of the next chapter of this story. How she trains, where she competes, whether the physical issues that have shadowed her season continue to limit her, all of that will shape what her ranking looks like heading into the second half of the year and what her options are at the slams that matter most to her. The people in her corner, her current coaching setup, her support team, will be working through the same questions that the wider tennis world is now asking more loudly. There is still time. She is 22. Careers at this level are long, and the sport has seen players rebuild from lower points than this one. The case for optimism exists. It is not a naive case, but optimism in professional sport has to be earned through matches and through results. And both of those things require an athlete who is physically whole, emotionally stable, and able to compete without the kind of accumulated fatigue that was visible tonight. Whether Emma Raducanu right now is in that place is a question that cannot be answered by a press conference, by a ranking update, or by a single result on a single evening. What can be said is this: the tennis world watched something real tonight. Not performed, not packaged, not filtered through the usual mechanisms of sports media management. Something real emerged in that room briefly, and the sport is still sitting with what it means. Some careers are defined by their peaks. Others are defined by what happens in the long space between the first peak and whatever comes next. And that second kind of definition is almost always more revealing about who an athlete actually is, and what they are actually capable of, than the first kind ever manages to be.